You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Levitt from the Social Science Research Council, and I'd like to first begin by welcoming our panelists in the audience and by thanking our partners from the Japan Foundation and the East-West Center for supporting this year's Abe Fellows Global Forum, Hedging Against Risk, Japan in an Uncertain World, Geodynamics of Northeast Asia. A series of crises over the last several years, including the COVID pandemic, rising tensions between China and the US, natural disasters brought on by global warming, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions regime have shaken the globalized trading system and produced shortages in goods, energy, raw materials, food supplies, and labor. Access to these resources is a strategic bargaining chip in international relations as nations seek to secure supplies of food, raw materials, and energy in the global marketplace. Our panelists today, Mireya Solis, Ulrich Schade, and Philip Lipsey, will discuss how nations, with a focus on Japan, hedge risks in a world in which the global flow of goods, data, and services is regularly interrupted by natural hazards, man-made conflict, and political relationships within the international order. We do regret that Ann Kokas, who is also scheduled to speak today, will be unable to join us. Our speakers all come out of the Abe Fellowship Program, which ran for over 30 years as a partnership between the Social Science Research Council and the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. The program represents our shared commitment to supporting high-quality research on important issues of global concerns along transnational lines of inquiry and supported over 440 Abe Fellows across the US and Japan. We hold these forums once a year as an opportunity to share their important work. We're pleased to welcome you here today and are eager to hear your questions after today's panel discussion concludes. Before we begin, though, I'd like to turn it over to Masaya Shimoyama, the Director General of the Japan Foundation's New York office.
Thank you, Nicole-san. On behalf of the Japan Foundation, I'd like to say thank you very much all for tuning into the Abe Global Forum 2023. Please allow me to start by acknowledging just some of the individuals without whom this event would not be possible. At the SSRC, thank you, Nicole, Bree, and Fred. At the East-West Center, thank you, Sato-san and Latoya-san. And to each of the wonderful speakers, thank you, Mireya-san, Ulrike-san, Philip-san. There are even more behind the scenes, and we thank you. As you know, the Abe Fellowship Program, as described by Nicole just now, is winding down after 30 years and supporting almost 450 fellows due to the fiscal constraints within the Japan Foundation. It's very sad, but we are, however, working with the SSRC to create new programming to support, connect, and empower this important network of fellows and to contribute to the development of global partnerships among network members beyond by engaging the next generation of scholars to generate new opportunities for collaboration and research on issues of global concern. We are now trying to finalize details of the programming, and we will make an announcement very soon. Thank you very much, and then back to you, Nicole.
I actually think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Limaya at the East-West Center now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you, Shimoyama-san. It's great to be working with the Japan Foundation and with the Social Science Research Council. We have gathered today an extraordinary group of eminent experts on Japan and Japan's place in the world across various issues and expertise. And you have on your program those names, but let me just introduce them to you. Our first speaker will be Professor Mireya Solis, who was an Abe Fellow 2004. She is at the Brookings Institution, where she directs the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. And she's also the Senior Fellow, Foreign Policy Center and the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies. So welcome, Mireya, and you'll be joining us to speak about hedging against risk and balancing economic connectivity and economic security. We also have with us Professor Ulrika Scheid, as mentioned earlier, from the University of California, San Diego, where she is professor of Japanese business and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. And we'll be speaking about the private sector and businesses and how they are hedging against risk and adapting to the new global and regional environment. And not last but not at all least, of course, we have Professor Philip Lipsey, who also is, like the previous two speakers, an Abe Fellow, is currently at the University of Toronto, where he's professor in the Department of Political Science at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and chair of Japanese Politics and Global Affairs, and directs the Center for the Study of Global Japan. So as you can see, we have an extraordinarily able set of speakers for our program today, and I'd just like to get right to hearing from them. So over to you, Maria, first.
Thank you very much, Satu. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure truly to participate in the Abe Global webinar and to share the stage with friends and colleagues, fellow Abe Fellows. So the main point I want to emphasize, I think that Satu already highlighted, and that is that as Japan seeks to hedge against risk in a more turbulent international economic environment, I would posit that it faces a very difficult and challenging balancing act. Because on the one hand, it feels compelled to continue to foster economic connectivity through trade agreements, through digital diplomacy, through infrastructure investment, while at the same time adapting to an environment that is changing very quickly, and where one of the main trends here is the securitization of international economic relations. So the balancing act comes from the fact that Japan is trying to advance economic integration, but at the same time also thinking about the risks that come from economic interdependence and how to then prepare to diminish some of the vulnerabilities that are created when you open and integrate with others, especially in this era. So one way to summarize the challenge that I believe Japan faces is, what does it mean to be a champion of free trade in a world of growing geopolitical cleavages and economic nationalism? And for example, how do you promote a rules-based order when governments increasingly pull out the national security card and say, well, you know, this gives me a space to not necessarily comply with international rules or with prior commitments I've made because essential security interests are at stake. So then this is, I think, the difficult terrain that Japan must navigate as it seeks to hedge against risk. So because I have to be careful about keeping within the allotted time, let me just tell you the ground that I'm preparing to cover today very briefly. First, I want to tell you a little bit about how Japan became a champion of free trade, because again, this was not always the case. This is a very important change over the past decade. What are the consequences of that? And secondly, tell you a little bit more about why we find ourselves in this era of economic security now becoming such an important concern for Japan's foreign economic policy, but not only Japan, across different geographies, we find countries increasingly developing these new tools of foreign economic policy. And then I would like to offer some brief reflections about what this means for US-Japan relations and what this means for Japan's international role. So let me see if I can cover all that ground in the remaining time, and if not, I'll be happy to elaborate further in the Q&A. So let me start with Japan's new leadership position in the world of international trade. As I was saying before, Japan has changed quite a bit in this front. It was known more as a passive actor in the international trading system, playing defense always, trying to protect its market, and not really stepping up to negotiate ambitious trade agreements or to codify cutting-edge rules on trade and investment. However, this changed dramatically over the last decade, and certainly the best example of this was Japan joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiations in 2013 and coming ready to negotiate in ways in which it had never done before. So much so that now Japan finds itself as a founding member of a crop of mega trade agreements that are making a real difference. That is the successor agreement to the TPP, which is a handful to say, but is a comprehensive and progressive TPP. Then a Japan-EU trade agreement, and the most recent addition, which is a vast trade agreement among 15 Asian economies, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And China is a member of that agreement. Now, the great irony, of course, is that just as Japan found its voice on pushing for a more ambitious trade agenda, this happened at the same time that the United States receded and that gave very much the mantle of trade leadership. And of course, here there's much to say, but clearly that when the United States stepped out from the TPP, when President Trump came into office, that was a huge blow to the United States. It was a huge blow to the participating countries. But this is not where things ended, because President Trump liked to be called a tariff man. And very quickly, there were increasing tariffs. First of all, the US-China trade war, but also the fact that under Trump, the United States imposed so-called national security tariffs on its own allies. Now, fast forward to President Biden, and there are significant differences here. President Biden does want to collaborate with its allies, but still a very skeptical view on international trade and the position that traditional free trade agreements do not really meet the needs of the time, even though, as I just indicated, countries in the region feel very differently as they continue to negotiate mega trade agreements. So what the United States is putting on the table is something different. It's not a traditional trade agreement. It's a so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There are 14 participants. There can be areas where it's promising. I'm happy to elaborate further as we get into the conversation, but this is not going to be an exercise in further tariff liberalization, nor is it going to be subject to congressional ratification, meaning that it's an executive agreement, and therefore there are questions as to where this can survive American politics, because the next president can come and think, this was not what I want to pursue. And then, as you can see, then this is an area where Japan has found a new role, just as the United States has taken a very different direction. Now, let me bring you to an area where I think it's really where most of the action is taking place, but where we must proceed with great caution, and that is economic security. Why are we witnessing this fusion between economics and national security? Again, just very quickly, given that time is running, I would just say that clearly great power competition between the United States and China is a major driver here, because economic objectives and economic tools are central to how the United States are playing out this rivalry. Then, of course, we're in the midst of a profound technological revolution, and that means that the stakes are very high. These are referred to as platform technologies, whereby they're going to shape both the sources of economic competitiveness, but they're also critical to military readiness. So the stakes are very high in being on the cutting edge in generating these industries. And of course, the pandemic exposed many of the risks of disruptions to the supply chain. And so we find ourselves, therefore, in this era where many countries are pursuing the two sides of economic security. One is to promote, and then we see a revival of industrial policy to try to promote greater innovation and more investment there, but also protection of critical infrastructure, of critical technology. And this is reflected in a number of defensive economic measures, such as export controls, supply chain resilience efforts that may be about onshoring and the like. Now, Japan and the United States, I would make the observation that they're very much on the same page. They're very much on the same page in the importance of developing this new toolkit of economic security. They're very much on the same page in thinking about some of the implications of the China challenge. But nevertheless, there are differences here that both allies need to reconcile. One, I would say that the United States is pushing for supply chain resilience policies that tend to lean very heavily on onshoring and less so on friendshoring. And therefore, this has created some friction, some difficulties certainly when it comes, for example, to electric vehicles and tax credits that the United States is going to give only if the vehicle is assembled in the United States. And again, this does not go in North America. This does not go very well with our friends and allies. And very importantly, I would say that the United States very recently has redefined the nature of technological competition with China. The idea is that we used to have a sliding scale approach. As long as we were ahead of China, things were okay. Now with China's civil military policies, the United States government is making the case that stalling Chinese technological development is necessary and is asking its allies to come on board. And here, therefore, is a very significant ask for Japan. And in closing, then I would say that how Japan coordinates with the United States has become critical on the economic security front. What this means for the future of Japan-China relations is very important. Japan maintains that it wants to keep very constructive economic relations with China, but as long as it continues to coordinate, say, on export controls with the United States, that's going to be harder to accomplish. And finally, and this is a broader reflection, and this is why my note on caution, the more we see governments using the card of national security interest to intervene in markets, to shy away from established rules and commitments, the risk is that we may end up undermining the rules-based order, which is Japan's paramount interest, as well as the United States and many others. So let me wrap up with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maria, for getting us off to a terrific start. I mean, I really like your framing of the central challenge faced by Japan, and kind of flows naturally this scene setter for the larger policy challenges that Japan faces, by turning now to Professor Ulrika Schid, who's going to talk about the private sector and how corporates and businesses in Japan are adapting to some of these risks as well, because they will play into these national policies challenges that you described. Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. And good morning from Tokyo, where it's sunny and too warm for the season. So I would like to make 3 points today, and I'll give you some background on how I ended up making these 3 points. But the 3 points I want to make is that Japanese companies are, of course, not standing still and waiting for governments to do something. They're working with the government, but they're doing basically, as I can see now, 3 things to hedge against risk. The first is that they've lowered their own dependencies on others, and I'll lay out what I mean by that. The second is that they have created dependencies for others as a sort of a security play. And third, they're working with the government and asking for insurance and protection in ways that I think are then reflected in what Mireia is observing as she's looking at government actions. So let me make these points in order. And as a professor who looks at business and as a business scholar, I'm taking the perspective of the CEO of a company. Okay, so if we're going into the company at the head of the, and also there are of course a large range of companies. Let's look at Japan's best companies and what they are doing in terms of carving out these strategies. There are people who are not doing this, but that may be a different topic. So basically in business and management theory, there's long been, for 45 years now, an insight that is comes under the label of resource dependence theory. It's a book that was published in 1978 first, and it's basically part of every a single business strategy framework that we have, that we're thinking about resource dependence. So thinking about being dependent on others that's part of business strategy, and so it's not something new that companies are doing. And so maybe some of the things that Japanese companies have been doing over the last 10 years is sort of fortunate that they work in these ways. Others may have been much more strategic, but in any event, here are the outcomes, what we see. In terms of reducing their own dependencies, a lot of Japan's leading companies have assumed strategies that would help reduce those. So for instance, they are charging for their product in yen. which is a fairly simple way. If you have the market power to do it, it's the best way to hedge against foreign exchange fluctuations. They have, in some ways, reorganized their supply chains by pulling out of relying on one country, in particular China, too much, and rather building a production network in Southeast Asia. This also is not just manufacturing. This applies to insurance companies and banks just the same. So they've diversified the global production network, and they've invested in their own shipping capabilities and so forth, so that they're not dependent on others to bring products to places. They're in many cases are manufacturing in the markets that they're selling into. So for instance, you may be aware that last year, Toyota was the largest car company in the United States, and also was manufacturing most cars in the United States before General Motors, right? And so those are all signs of creating a global production network that would then reduce some of these political constraints that are coming up now. The second measure is, or outcome of strategy positioning, is to create dependencies for others. And I've written about this in my recent book. I won't have time to talk to you about everything that's in the book, but under the title of Business Reinvention of Japan, I've been looking at how Japan's leading companies have positioned to become upstream suppliers of global supply chains in critical parts. And there are a large number of product areas where Japanese companies combine to 100% global market share in something like fine chemicals for electronics parts. So we're not even talking about the screen that you're looking at, but the chemicals that go into the screen, so that the screen that you're looking at gives you a blacker black, or enable you to look at it sunshine or from an angle. And so these parts are critical for the part makers, which often sit in South Korea and Taiwan. And those parts are then critical for the assemblers that are maybe in China. And in the case of the iPhone that we're all very familiar with, all of this then leads up to dependencies with somebody in California who is in charge of managing those supply chains. Japanese companies are, of course, subject to shocks in demand in these supply chains, but they sit pretty because they're supplying the critical parts, so nobody can make an iPhone or a semiconductor without certain chemicals from Japan. Right? That is not a reduction of dependence. It's a building up of dependencies that actually is widely known as a part of a really clever move in resource dependence theory, because then others are dependent on you. You can trade, you can do horse trades on things. Okay, both of these combine to my third point, which is politics. And so the Japanese government, of course, as Mireya just laid out beautifully, is looking at all of this and is very nervous. And how do we play this and what do we do? And let me just add something to what she said, and that is the new and changing needs of Japan's largest companies, which of course the government is listening to. And those needs, I feel increasingly, are expressed as not so much help us build a trade agreement or help us lower tariffs, because that's important. but the tariffs are not so important for Japanese companies that are producing in those countries. What is important for those companies is protect our assets abroad. Make sure that our chemical plant in country X will not be expropriated, is safe from some wildly fluctuating government policies or things like that. And the Japanese government has reacted to this in two ways. I think it's a reaction, although who knows which way that arrow goes. But in any event, the resulting policies are a large number of new insurance policies. In particular, a place that I find very interesting is called Nexi, which used to be part of METI and is now its own freestanding insurance company for foreign business for Japanese companies. And another is an increase in a longer-term trend of bilateral agreements that the Japanese government is forging with these countries, where Japanese companies are building production assets. So let me just close on a number there. Over the past 10 years, even though it's been widely said that the Japanese GDP has been stagnant and the Japanese economy looks, as if it's stagnant. If you look at Japanese GNP, which is to say the activity of Japanese companies abroad, it's been growing roughly 8% CAGR over the last 10 years or so, which means it's up, no matter what the shocks are. So it's very clear that the investments of Japanese companies and the productive activity of Japanese manufacturers and the service sector has been shifted outside Japan. We don't see it in GDP, but that doesn't mean, actually that means less and less. It doesn't mean it does not mean nothing, but it means less and less and less as we want to assess what the stakes are for Japanese companies. So let me stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ulrika. That was terrific, and really, I hope we'll come back to the issue of who's sort of pushing who. The Japanese private sector is pushing the government, or the government is trying to bring Japanese companies along with their management of these challenges that Maria laid out. There were some very interesting things in your presentation about which way companies may be leaning. Seems to be more towards the security and protection side of things. So I hope we can explore that more. We now turn to Professor Philip Lipsey. Philip, over to you, sir.
Great. Well, thank you to SSRC, the Japan Foundation, and the East-West Center for hosting today's event, as well as all of you in the audience for showing up to listen. So I'm going to take a somewhat different angle on this issue. My colleagues and I published a research paper recently that looks at variation in the ability of countries to transform their economic systems, in particular in regards to energy and climate change. And that is one potential strategy that countries can utilize in responding to large-scale risks. So I'll basically talk about that research, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to address other issues, including Japan's role in all of this as well. So the paper I'll be describing is joint work with Jonas Meckling at UC Berkeley, Jared Finnegan at LSE, and Florence Metz at University of Twente. And it was published in the journal Science in October 2022. And the title was Why Nations Lead or Lag in Energy Transitions. The work wasn't directly supported by the Abe Fellowship, but it was very much a natural extension of both the research I conducted under the Abe Fellowship, as well as the collaborations I started building around this question of Japanese energy policy and climate change policy. I'd like to thank the Abe Fellowship for their support of my research that ultimately contributed to this work. So our article broadly emphasizes the importance of considering the political context as we seek to understand transformative policy change. And this is a very salient issue today, precisely because the war in Ukraine has triggered disruptions in the energy market on top of what we were already experiencing in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we see quite a bit of variation in national responses to this disruption. You see some countries seeking large-scale transformations, decarbonization, accelerating the use of renewable energy, and so forth. And in other cases, you see more of kind of a band-aid approach, reducing energy prices temporarily, subsidizing the production of fossil fuels to try to reduce the impact of this disruption for consumers. And so, the basic question we ask is, why do countries vary so much in how they react to this kind of major crisis episode? And we identify basically three broad strategies that countries seem to follow. The first is based on insulation. And the idea here is that policymakers are able to insulate themselves from potential opponents of a large policy change. Inevitably, when you try to implement transformational change, somebody is going to face costs. It might be people who work in a particular industry that's no longer going to be very active. Coal is often pointed out as an important sector in decarbonization efforts, where there's a lot of resistance from both coal capital and labor. And in terms of insulation, we talk about there are certain kinds of political institutions that help to buffer government decision makers from that kind of potential backlash. One that goes back to literature from several decades ago is this idea of autonomous bureaucracies, and the idea that if you have bureaucracies that operate somewhat independently of politics, that they might be able to push policy forward, right? This literature also connects to the idea of independent central banks and creating institutions that are not influenced by the day-to-day incentives of politics. But there are also theories about electoral systems, how politicians are elected, and the idea that, for example, proportional electoral systems are better able to insulate politicians from potential voter backlash about high energy costs. And so, some examples here would be France, in responding to the 1970s energy shock, of course, builds up very massively nuclear as a centerpiece of electricity production. And similarly, Japan in the same era, under the guidance of MITI at the time, now renamed METI, is very successful in implementing energy conservation measures, ramping up nuclear, and essentially Japan's dependence on Middle East oil largely flatlines. So, both of those cases are oftentimes seen as successful examples of transformative change in the energy sector. And today, the response that France is following, I would say, is quite similar to the policy response in the 1970s. It's still very much based on large state influence over the utility sector. But on the other hand, in Japan, there's quite a bit of a big difference. And, I would attribute this to some of the major institutional changes that have taken place in Japan that have, for example, empowered politicians relative to the bureaucracy, so that bureaucratic insulation has been weakened, and the electoral system has changed to one that makes politicians somewhat more sensitive to consumer backlash over things like energy price volatility. So compared to the 1970s, Japan's response to the recent crisis in Ukraine has placed much more emphasis on things like lowering wholesale oil prices and trying to maintain interests in Russian natural gas projects, the Band-Aid type of solutions rather than the major transformative change that other kind of countries are pursuing. Another key strategy that countries can pursue rather than insulation is compensation, to basically compensate the losers of large-scale policy transformation. And there are certain kinds of institutions that help with this, including corporatist interest group intermediation of the type that you see in Northern Europe. Established welfare state institutions can make it easier to compensate people who lose their jobs because of economic transformations. And so Germany, as well as some Nordic countries, are often held up as examples of this type of transformative change, which is not based on insulating from opponents, but basically paying off the opponents. So, well, we're going to close down these coal mines, but we will provide financial incentives so that you can still make a living and then eventually transfer to other sectors of the economy. Now, there's also a third category that we describe as market-based transition. And this is essentially the absence of policy-driven transformation. So some countries don't really have strong institutions that either insulate policymakers or allow for effective compensation. And we would put the United States and Australia in this category. And in these countries, you tend to see much more volatility in energy and climate change policymaking, the absence of stability, right? So, the quintessential example would be Democrats in the United States come in and put in all kinds of environmental regulation, and the Republicans come in and repeal it. And so you see this back and forth pattern. Very much similar story in Australia with Tony Abbott repealing the carbon tax, for example. Australia became the first country to repeal a carbon tax in the world. And so in these countries, it's quite difficult to have a stable policy in favor of large-scale transformation because the opponents of policy change are often in a position to effectively block that change. So, you can occasionally see moments of optimism, but they often prove to be transient. So some of the lessons for policy that we draw from this work are that one size does not fit all, right? So there's no single solution that you can use across countries to promote large-scale transformative change. So in countries where there are institutions that are supportive of insulation or compensation, utilizing those institutions effectively is a good strategy to push things forward. So, how to bundle incentives so that attractive compensation packages can be built and become sustainable, for example. On the other hand, in countries where those kinds of institutions are less available, it may be more of an issue of waiting for those leading countries to roll out technologies and new innovations first. But then once there's a cost advantage that appears, right? Renewable energy, right? At this point, solar and wind are very cost competitive with fossil fuels. When that price attractiveness comes to a certain level, then to commit to free market principles and support the rollout of those new technologies according to market incentives. And the other point that we make is even in these market-based countries, there are policies that can still be pursued, including supporting research and development, essentially promoting innovation-based policies. The Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration follows this type of logic to subsidize research, to support innovation, to solve these problems. And of course, there are also pockets of insulation. California, for example, has some institutions that help energy policy be relatively insulated compared to other parts of the United States. So taking advantage of insulation and compensation where it is more available, even in countries where at the national level, these institutions are weak, would be one strategy that we suggest. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm happy to talk about Japan as well as other issues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Philip. That was also really terrific and interesting. I have some questions for you as well. We're talking for all of us before we go to Q&A, and I do at this point want to reiterate to our attendees and participants that the Q&A function on this Zoom call can be used to submit your questions or comments, which you might want a response to. So please feel free to do that. But in the meantime, let me raise a couple of larger issues. I mean, we're talking about, on the one end, government policy in general about the integration agenda of Japan and the order, rules-based order versus the securitization. Is it the view, Maria, of Japan that this is an either-or choice? I know you framed it in a way that sort of highlighted or kind of intensified the choice, but could one kind of push this and say, in a way, Japan is doing both simultaneously in a very effective way? It's integrating via RCEP and CPTPP, while carefully, discreetly aligning with US alliance requirements for securitization in specific sectors and on particular areas of concern. At the same time, playing a role at the global level to respond to, for example, Chinese aid increases by helping to reform World Bank and IMF and ADB. So in a way, might Japan be a great example of a country that's navigating these tricky terrain?
Thank you very much. So I think that's a great question. And certainly Japan is pursuing both. And also there are many different views inside Japan as to what is the right balance. So it was not an either or, but how you balance both imperatives.
Sure.
Because certainly once Japan was capable to put together an economic statecraft of greater ambition, then the payoffs were very clear. I mean, Japan was now vocalizing what new rules on trade and investment, the data, the digitalization agenda, all of those things then became things that you associate with Japan in a way in which you had never before. And they complement Japan's economic interests, foreign policy interests. But, you know, there are different ways in which countries play or are fleshing out their economic security toolkits. And some are better at making them compatible with the economic interdependence agenda. In some ways, I think that Japan is in a better place, say, than the United States, because there's greater balance between the connectivity and the protection side of the economic statecraft. Whereas, as I was trying to convey in my short remarks, the United States, once it stepped out of TPP and put this IPEF that's still very light on the substance and certainly does not really promote that long-term market integration. They don't have the market access. It's very unclear if you don't have that, whether participants will agree to ambitious rule on environment, labor, and digital. The United States does not have that balance right. So I think that that's one area where Japan is ahead of the United States, that it can have the mega trade agreements, but also begin to launch these new policies on economic security. Then there are also ways in which you think about the nature of the China challenge and the measures that you implement. I think that Japan has been far more skeptical about notions of decoupling from China. And certainly the United States, for all the rhetoric, is not decoupling from China by any means. On the contrary, trade flows between the two economies remain very, very robust. But the rhetoric is different in the United States than it is in Japan on the question of decoupling. And the United States, you know, had that stage one trade agreement with China that does not amount to much, where Japan does have the regional comprehensive economic partnership that is not as ambitious as TPP, but nevertheless should not be minimized. It's an important trade agreement just by the sheer scale and by the fact that there were more commitments that people initially expected. And another element here is that the United States also has China-specific measures. And I think that Japan has tried to shy away from that. And if they boost economic security, they don't do it by targeting one specific country. And even though the real consequence might be that it's Chinese telecom companies who don't have access to the Japanese market, nevertheless, you frame the policy in a way that is not openly discriminatory and therefore does not push against international rules as much as the United States does. And my final point here, and why I think the United States is not playing this balance in the same way as Japan, is with the national security tariffs that the Trump administration imposed, WTO cases were launched. A decision was recently reached. The dispute settlement body reached a decision that found that the United States was on the wrong, because There is Article 21 that provides a national security exemption. It's been there since the beginning. But the idea is that you have to meet certain conditions, because otherwise everybody can just say, national security, and the floodgates of protectionism would open. And the United States refused to make its case in the WTO as to why it was not, why it was invoking national security, just saying that it's nobody can second guess a country when they say national security is involved. And now they've said they're not going to comply with that ruling, and they decided to appeal into the limbo because the appellate body is not working. And those are actions that undermine the fabric of the multilateral trading regime. So for all those, and Japan is not doing that. So I'm trying to do a contrast in how you navigate. It's the same landscape, and nevertheless, countries are making very different decisions on how to balance economic integration and economic security, and how to try to minimize the potential damage to the multilateral trading regime.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. It's so rich, and many things Maria, that I agree with. I'm going to just push then what this means, right? In the context of the US-Japan alliance, Article 2, which we often speak less about, is about US and Japan coordinating on alliance management regarding economic issues internationally, and their role together. So what are the implications for the alliance of this asymmetric adaptation to risk? And I might provoke just a little bit to push the agenda, which as you know, I'm not a particularly advocating at all, but just suggesting maybe the asymmetry is explained by the fact that the United States can get away with more because its resource capacity and its market ensures the ability to adapt to risk in this way, rather than the Japan need with less resources and more need for connectivity and integration, given demographic issues and other requirements for manufacturing and supply chains, that the US doesn't have to. And one kind of factoid about this is the extraordinary Japanese investment in the United States, which kind of, if you will, leapfrogs the lack of market access in IPEF. So I wondered how you might respond to this US-Japan dynamic in addition to the Japan adaptation dynamic.
Yeah, well, I think that, on the origins and consequences of this asymmetry, a talking point that was very much used when the United States was still believing in TPP is that 95% of consumers are outside the United States. So the United States does need access to these markets. And the United States is already a relatively open economy. And therefore, when it negotiates these trade agreements, in many cases, it's those other countries who bring the tariffs down much more than the United States does. So I don't think it necessarily has to do with that asymmetry, but how the domestic politics play in each country. And a very interesting thing is that, for example, Japan, you don't have the globalization backlash or the anti-trade agenda making it to, in a way in which, it was very visible in 2016 presidential election. And even today, I think it remains a very significant constraint about how the Democrats can talk about trade agreements, because a large portion of their Democratic coalition is not in favor of trade agreements. So I do take to heart, I believe that Biden and Blinken and all these other officials, when they articulate these very skeptical views of trade agreements, I think that they believe it. And I feel that that puts us at a great disadvantage, because when they go to the region and say free trade agreements are the instrument of the 20th century, I feel that they are not really reading the room, and they're not really realizing where many countries are heading towards, and we're missing an opportunity. Now, where does this leave Japan and the United States? Well, as you know, Prime Minister Kishida visited Washington recently, and it was interesting that in a policy speech he gave at SAIS, the one ask he had at this time where there's tremendous convergence and alignment, and it also is very positive in the US-Japan alliance, certainly because of Japan's security reforms and whatnot. The one ask he had of President Biden is come back to the TPP. And I think that, again, that highlights, and it's interesting because Japan is credited for helping the United States bring on board many of Southeast Asia into the IPEF. And nevertheless, Prime Minister Kishida is telling the United States that it's not enough and that TPP remains the more robust trade agreement. Now, I think that that's going to be an area where the two countries are not going to be operating in sync for a very long time. But when it comes to the economic security, you do have a very budding and emerging agenda, and there are now joint R&D proposals. I think it's very interesting that just a few days ago, and we don't have the details, the Japanese government and the Netherlands, they both agreed to this new export control rule of the United States, which is quite unprecedented because it begins to operationalize that new view of what is the technological competition with China, and is preventing Chinese access to cutting edge technologies. So I haven't, none of the governments have released the details of the supposed agreement. And I want to see how Japan talks about that decision and how it answers the question, are you signing on to the American definition of what it takes to compete with China? And that is to prevent Chinese access to these crowning heights on the new innovation frontier, and how China will react to that. I don't think that it's going to be so easy to keep relations as stable once that economic security coordination with the United States begins to bite.
Yeah, and that's a terrific point, maybe to move to another one of our panelists, but that has really been on my mind is if you're willing to straddle, how will your integration with China be affected by a decision to align with the US on this? What kinds of responses might China make that would blunt the Chinese openness to Japanese manufacturing, and what kinds of steps might China take in retaliation depending on what Japan has agreed to do in that trilateral agreement with the Dutch. So yeah, let's keep watch on that, but I really deeply appreciate your insights and expertise, and thank you so much, Maria. I do want to say, and I'll come to Philip in a moment, but first want to turn to Ulrika, but I kept looking at Philip's 3-point insulation, payoff, and market-driven adaptation on energy transition and wondering how those would be applied to the challenges that you posed, the kind of dilemma between integration and securitization of risk, right? Would the same factors apply, or is that just an example? Energy is one example of where you could draw out some lessons, because this is a broader front that you're describing, which is about economics, trade, FDI, technology sharing, which is maybe a little bit broader than just energy transitions. But Ulrika, I really appreciated, your talk about private sector, but I confess that I took away, perhaps wrongly in listening to you, it sounded very more on the defensive side that Japanese business is looking for ways to protect. In other words, it really is hedging very hard on the risks by creating dependencies, by trying to get government support for insurance through bilateral arrangements. Am I wrong? Did I misinterpret the heavy emphasis or the tilt towards more protection and more discrete risk aversion than kind of going out boldly and looking for new initiatives, pressing the Japanese government to no, keep pushing integration because we need global markets, global rules, global order for our businesses? Please help me a little bit to understand that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If that's what you took away, then I completely misspoke. Okay. So I apologize and withdraw my comment. Let me try again. No, not at all. I mean, business scholars don't think about the world in the same way as Mireya does and others do. Right? So business scholars have a pretty clear objective, which is sell at a high profit. And what does it take to sell at a high profit? And I would say what I was trying to talk about with these dependencies, all businesses always do this, right? For 40 years, companies have positioned themselves in the market in ways that would reduce their dependence on others and increase their power over others, right? This is Michael Porter's 5 forces. This is just textbook strategic management. Nothing has changed in this. What is changing is the rhetoric about decoupling and so forth. And the one point I didn't make, and maybe I should have, and that might have made it clearer, is that if there were no politics, there would be no problem right now in the Asian trade, because Japan needs the Asian markets need Japan. Everybody is kind of going, what's wrong? What happened? We had it going. We had the whole Asian thing set out, right? And but there's of course politics, and so companies, and so far as they pay the detailed attention to it that you do, which I don't think they do actually, are just looking into, okay, how are we going to protect our assets? What are we going to do? Oh, there's now, there's a supply chain holdup in the LA port, or there's there's noise about tariffs. Oh, what do we do? And so that's pretty reactive, because I mean, businesses are not in the business of forecasting political moves, right? And so there's also this aspect that you just asked about, Satu, which is, I think from the business perspective, the United States is becoming increasingly unreliable. And so we just don't know what's going to happen. So let's make sure that we're not, falling on a hard rock here if things happen. So there's a lot of hedging going on, but it doesn't work in the way that maybe you all think about hedging. It's more, okay, we have so everything beyond 6 months hedging in business is speculation. And so airlines that buy fuel, if it's longer, if their hedges are longer than a year, then it's speculation. They're speculating on something happening in the world, right? And so businesses look at this at a much more immediate thing, and they now they're interested in, okay, so is there a long train? Is there a train that we can see farther from the distance about China? And do we need to rethink and diversify into Southeast Asia? But basically, it's not reactive. And I think it's actually very proactive for Japanese businesses for any business right now. It's not even, I'm not even talking about Japanese companies only, right? I feel like all companies are doing this. They're looking at the lay of the land, and they say, okay, so there's some noise here. This is not good. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. So let's make sure that we're not left behind when turn bad. And so they go to government and lobby, but they also do their own things, and their own things are actually more important, I think. That they diversify production networks. And if the government helps that, again, so the business ask for that support, or did the government offer the support? That we could probably both kind of coming together, but they're actually very proactive in how they're trying to shift their strategies and trying to make sure that they're not selling anymore.
Thank you so much for helping me understand that. I am sorry that I failed to fully appreciate that, but I want to press a little bit. You said that Japanese businesses perhaps see more risk or unreliability, if I heard you right, about the U.S. Then one question is sort of how to explain Japanese companies investing significant amounts in the U.S., rather large amounts, growing amounts, in fact, in the trend line. Do you see that as just temporary, given the sort of 6-month window, or is this some sort of also part of their insulation bet against risk? And what, aside from the narrow things like some support for diversification, lots was made in the press about the relatively modest amount of Japanese government money to move things out of China. There was kind of a lot of play about, leaving. And yet you hear that, I heard recently from an important source in Tokyo that almost 30% of Japanese profit shares for big companies do still come from China. Whether the figure is right, I don't know. But more important is it's a very sizable amount of Japanese corporate profits still rely on being integrated with China in some sense. So I wondered if you could help me understand, that balance between that short-term calculations of companies that you mentioned, and the decision to make long-term investment decisions that are heavily in the US versus, and what are Japanese companies asking for on the broader front? Nothing. They don't care whether CPTPP comes into play or RCEP comes into play, or do they? Are they arguing for such things?
Yeah, lots of questions here. The businesses don't see the United States as unreliable in terms of assets not being safe, right? So they invest in the United States because it's a huge market. Partially, the U.S. asked that during the trade wars in the 1990s and the local content rules. So that was initially a policy play, and then Toyota and friends said, "Oh, look, we're here. Great. This is actually perfect. We can we can make the stuff here, and the cars and Camrys and Honda Civics and whatnot, and then we don't even have exchange rate troubles and whatnot. So we can actually do this." So more than half of Japanese cars are no longer made in Japan, right? So your number about the 30% is a little bit. I think that's a trade number. That's profits from but trade is no longer even the biggest or it's certainly not the only income stream. It's the revenues that are earned by in the global production network that are becoming more and more important. And how large China is in this is actually a very interesting question that I have to now go and look and see what that number actually is. That's a great question. I don't think it's 30%, but it's probably large. So the way I think a business person here thinks about the discussion that we're having here is that, and I've heard this actually, this is a quote from last week from an interview. We never really paid much attention to this economic security, and that's METI does that, right? We didn't pay attention, but now we should probably know something with the war in Ukraine and so forth. So we should know more. And I was very surprised by that comment. This is a leading, company that household brand name, and it's like, "Whoa, you didn't know about this?" So yeah, no, we're, and so I just think that we may be overthinking the how important politics is in how businesses make strategy. Sure. It's about production networks. It's about labor. It's about concerns about unions, and certainly tariffs are important, right? So you kind of look and say, "Oh, we can't do that. Then we have to go there and ship it from there or something." It's about things that have actually something to do with production and sales and profits, and all of this other stuff are risks that will enter the equation at some point, but maybe not as prominently as our discussion here may make it think. Like, and so what does Japanese business want from the government? Well, whatever they can get, right? Whatever. So we don't want taxes. We don't want this. We don't want that. So they have a whole long list of things that they don't want. We want less regulation, more regulation. I don't know. Depending on the industry, but I don't think Japanese businesses go to government and say, "We want a CTP." They just say, "Can make it easier for us to, to forge a trade with this company in Australia or something." That's my view from talking to people here. I mean, there is no. In the C-suite of a company, there is no position called a chief political officer. That doesn't exist, and so maybe the strategy officer knows something about all of these things, but I think they rely on outside counsel on how to think about that.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. Let me turn to Philip. This very interesting insulation paying off on market-driven kind of responses to the energy transitions. I did want to ask you, I thought I heard you say France and Japan responded to the 73 oil crisis via what you described as an insulation strategy, these autonomous bureaucracies and et cetera. I wondered, the question that immediately jumped to me is, fine after 73, the move towards more civil nuclear power. I think the last time I read it, civil nuclear power was around 30%. Maybe that was pre-Fukushima shutdown. I'm not sure where it is now, 31% as I recall. What about after Ukraine? How would you describe the trends, if you will, the adjustment or adaptation to the risk after Ukraine? Turning back on nuclear, looking at, I just like to know a little bit more about that. And the second question I just pose is, your model looks at the kind of supply side of the policy response. And I wondered, that's the supply side of governments deciding how to handle this, right? Maybe through these three broad strategies. But clearly the external environment, in this case, I don't know what that is, the demand side or whatever, but is also changing the incentive structure. I mean, Russia has been changing the incentive structure for energy transitions by the moves it makes. So I'm just wondering how that affects the model that you have. I'm particularly thinking in terms of Ukraine, right? Because Russia has been going around making deals that change the incentive structure of an insulation or a paying off strategy or a market-driven strategy. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great questions. I think the post-Ukraine verdict, still remains open to some degree. Of course, countries have pursued a variety of strategies. The US is a good example, where initially it looked like, essentially kind of a let's lower gas prices and make life easier for drivers type of strategy. But the Biden administration came out with a fairly ambitious plan on energy and climate change. Of course, it remains to be seen whether that survives the next transition of power. And, I think the same could be said in Japan. It's very much still an evolving policy making context. So I wouldn't jump to conclusions necessarily based on what we're seeing so far. But you're absolutely right that the external environment provides a key impetus for these kinds of transformational changes. They're very rare. It's quite rare to see kind of an organic development of a transformational policy change. It's usually triggered by some kind of internal or external event that serves as an impetus for change. And so, the 73 oil crisis was an important impetus for many countries in trying to move off of oil to varying degrees. And I suppose, it remains to be seen whether the current energy shock triggered by the crisis in Ukraine is enough to accelerate policy transitions, and whether it'll be long lasting enough. Of course, energy prices have come down quite a bit already. And so, that sort of takes a little bit of the pressure off in many countries. I think the Japanese response, at least so far, can be characterized as more on the side of Band-Aid type of measures, right? So very much kind of an emphasis on reducing wholesale prices for oil to try to keep the pressure off of energy consumers. In Japan, this talk of let's recommit to nuclear, of course, this is still very much politically uncertain, and a type of policy that will perhaps pay dividends in the future. The kind of thing that the LDP and METI have been interested in doing anyway, but perhaps this provided a bit of a political opportunity. Now, if Japan is able to roll out nuclear at large scale, it could certainly make a difference. But I'm quite skeptical that that's really going to happen. On renewables, I think this is ultimately where there's the greatest potential in Japan. The commitment is there. The Suga government in particular came out with net zero pledge for 2050, and the current government is still maintaining that pledge. But the level of ambition, I think most would say, is still not what one would like to see from a country that prides itself for at least once having been a leader on energy conservation and energy efficiency. And last point, I suppose, kind of connecting back to your conversations with Mireia and Ulrike is, when we think about hedging risk, if you're in the United States, you tend to see US policy making in a normative sense, like what should the United States be doing and so forth. But looking from the outside, I think, it's very important to recognize that the US is a major risk that countries are either hedging against or trying to mitigate one way or the other. And, this really came to the fore, of course, under the Trump administration, these concerns about populism and isolationism and withdrawal and policy volatility. And I think, this really does tie into Japan's efforts to try to keep the US tied in to its traditional role as a leader in the liberal international order, and to try to encourage the US to come back to TPP. And, I think Japan, to its credit, does have a strategy, so far perhaps not paying dividends on the trade front. But, I think it is important to keep in mind that when we talk about hedging against risk, that the US domestic political system is quite a central risk today in the international system.
Thanks so much, Philip. And in fact, that is kind of a perfect segue into some of the questions that have been raised both by our live stream viewers and our Q&A section. And I'd like to turn to those, because this issue of, risk in the system is not sort of something abstract, but others in the system, maybe not in the US, do see the US policies, decisions, trends, trajectories as an element of risk, and certainly true. So let me turn to those questions, please. And I'd invite all of you, just as I state the questions, maybe each of you to respond as you wish, and maybe go around the room. If you don't have a response on a particular question, that's absolutely fine, of course, but I'll just lay them out there for all three of you to attend to as you wish. So the first question is from Ellis Kraus. Great panel. So congratulations. We got a attaboy from Professor Kraus. Great panel, but I was curious why no one mentioned much about the crucial hedging. Philip, your reminder there, in security and defense that Japan is doing. What Chris Hughes at work, and we had the pleasure of having Chris Hughes on an East-West Center program not long ago, at work calls bilateralism plus, i.e. trying to ensure other countries like UK and EU, in addition to the fundamental alliance with the US, will help defend Japan in case of crisis with China over Taiwan. So there's a kind of question. Maybe any of you wish to maybe take a stab at that, and then we'll turn to the 3 or 4 others that we have. Philip, do you want to start maybe, since you had the hedging comment?
Sure. No, I certainly think this is part of Japan's overall strategy to broaden its partnerships in security with countries aside from the United States. And certainly some of the things that Alice mentions here is part of that. I don't know if hedging is the right framework, in the sense that, in the absence of the United States, I don't think any of these things is going to save Japan, right? So if you take away the US-Japan alliance, this is not going to be an adequate hedge. But it does certainly strengthen Japan's position, and it could lighten the burden for the United States in the event of a contingency, a serious contingency over Taiwan with China, for example. So to that extent, I think it's right that these measures are taking place within that overall geopolitical framework of the relative balance of power between the US and China is shifting. And are there other ways in which Japan can strengthen its own position and that of the US-Japan alliance? But I would probably not think of it as a substitute for the alliance with the United States. I don't think anything really can substitute for that alliance relationship.
Yeah. Anyone else, Mireia or Ulrike, do you want to make a comment on this, please?
Just very briefly. First of all, Ellis, thank you so much for watching. Great to hear from you. My thoughts are very similar to Philip's, but I do think it's another part of what Japan has been doing. I recently finished that book manuscript, and one of the terms I use that is Japan becoming a network power. And what we're witnessing, I think, in East Asia or the Indo-Pacific is that we have now connective tissue that went from the hub and spoke alliance system to then developing these new cooperations amongst different configurations of countries. They can be bilateral, they can be trilaterals, and so forth. And Japan actually is one of the countries that's the most active doing that. And some of these partnerships are quite significant. I mean, just with Australia and the UK, for example, there is these reciprocal access agreements, and there's these defense cooperation agreements and joint training exercises. And as Philip was saying, and ties into the earlier question you asked me, Satu, I don't think it's an either or. I think that Japan is also trying to deepen its alliance with the United States. Now that it's going for counter-strike capability, larger defense expenditures, as you know very well, Satu, the reception in Washington was quite positive. But this is just the first step to then, well, now we really have to have even more in-depth conversations about what that means for command and control structures, for division of labor, for contingency planning. But the more that Japan has these other unilaterals or bilaterals growing, I think that helps Japan also deal with a regional environment that, it's not trending for the better, right? I mean, the situation in the Taiwan Straits, in the Korean Peninsula, and now with the tensions with Russia, Japan feels very much like there are three fronts, and not all the neighbors are friendly that way. And you see this diplomatic outreach that I think is an important asset for Japan going forward.
Thank you, Maria. Ulrika, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just a footnote. So thank you, Alice. I would say bilateralism plus, because that's actually what I meant when I said earlier that what business is concerned about is that they have these productive assets all around the world, and they would like the government to make sure that those countries are friendly. And so in addition to the security aspect that Alice is asking about, I think there could also be, in some cases, not in all of these, but in some cases also be an intent to make sure that we're friends, so that all of this stuff is all safe and tight. So absolutely, I think that's one of the drivers of the bilateralism, at least from where I'm looking at it.
This is a terrific discussion because, makes me kind of, I probably shouldn't say this, but, wondering about the title about hedging has such connotations, particularly in the context of risk, right? It has a very risk adjacent word is hedging. But, I wonder about equilibrium, because it seems to me you want to have enough support to the US by doing more yourself because you're worried about the US, so that the US wants to be reliable and wants to play the role, and it makes it easier for the US to play a role, but not so much that the US can say, well, you've got it, you've got this, which was suggested in previous administrations. Like, well, East Asia can perhaps take certain steps, like having nuclear weapons, and then you can take care of your own security. I mean, there's that opposite extreme, right? And so I think this equilibrium question really strikes me as Maria said, the right balance between these choices. Let me turn to the second question here, which is from a colleague here, Jitsuzumi-san. This is more like a comment than a question, and I think primarily directed to you, Maria. He says, I agree with Dr. Solis's comment about the Japanese business community skeptical about decoupling. From the standpoint of Japan's economic security, following the US policy 100% may also be a risk. Perhaps we should not forget that President Nixon's sudden visit to China marked a major shift in US policy towards China. How firm and sustainable is the US decoupling policy now? Could a regime change in China or in the US cause a flip-flop of that decoupling policy in the future? So maybe start, Maria, with you, since he specifically cited you, and then we can go around the room with Ulrika and then Philip.
Thank you. my sense is that the United States is not interested in pursuing wholesale decoupling, although the rhetoric sometimes hints in that direction, but that in some sectors, there is already fragmentation, and particularly in the high advanced technology, advanced manufacturing, where the United States is in many ways deploying export controls in a way in which they had not been done before, and where, with Huawei, for example, a very broad restriction on sending all kinds of components and so forth. So it's going to be by sector. And I think that if you look at the speech from Jake Sullivan of late September, where he identified the families of technologies that matter the most, we can expect that those are areas where the United States is going to play hardball and where we might see more fragmentation. Now, the question is, could this change, and could the United States eventually find a different approach towards China? I don't think that change is going to come anytime soon. I think that it has become politically safe in US domestic politics to take a tough on China approach. I think that the risk is if you open a flank so that the other side and the aisle can call you soft. We saw that the whole over-the-top messaging on the balloon, the Chinese balloon. I guess we cannot have a recent panel without making allusion to that, but that sort of captures a little bit of the climate, the political climate in the United States. So I think that, Biden had a great run in the first 2 years, legislative. A lot of bills were passed. I don't think that's possible as much in this second term with divided government, but where there could be some legislative packages approved, I think are going to be on the competition with China. I'm saying that just to highlight that is a very, that's the one area where there might be a closer convergence between the two sides of the political spectrum. Having said that, I also don't want to convey that Washington has a uniform view on China. This reminds me very much of the very heated debates about Japan and Japan's unstoppable economic engine and mercantilism and all those things. And I know that people one generation above us have like scars on their back from those conversations. So those conversations are happening now. They are perhaps more intense because China is also a military competitor of the United States. It's not a democracy, so we don't know what's happening inside. So it's hyper. All of this is more intense, but nevertheless, there's huge discussions and debates on Washington about the nature of the China challenge and the best approach to it. But in the political field, I would say that tough on China is a safe choice for the foreseeable future.
Right. That's really a great point. I mean, you hear so many news articles about the consensus around China, maybe in Congress and maybe in some elite levels, but the Harris poll was just out today. I would urge folks to look at American public views on China and North Korea are not quite as neat and as consensus built. And the very debate over the balloon, as it were, struck me as by the lack of consensus. And people responding on Twitter, which is probably not the best citation. But anyway, I was amazed by the debate. But Ulrika, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I want to just, maybe it's funny, but I want to underscore something that Mireya says, and that, I completely agree with everything Mireya says, but I wanted to highlight one thing she said, which is that on the ground, it's not clear how much decoupling has actually occurred in the Northeast Asian supply chains. So yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric. There's China and America. They're doing whatever they're doing. Sorry, the United States. Sorry, Philip. There's China and the United States, and they're doing whatever they're doing. And then there's business, and there's trade. So we know this from this event between Japan and South Korea, where Japan put 3 chemicals removed 3 chemicals from a white list of easy trade. That didn't mean anything other than that people had to fill out a form before they could ship it, right? So it wasn't actually a constraint. But as that happened, and there was this whole brouhaha about, what's happening, is this a decoupling? Has that happened? The CEO of Samsung Electronics was here asking, trying to figure out ways how we could get these chemicals some other way. Or lobbying for, let's not do this. So on the ground, it's not clear just how much of the Northeast Asian trade flows have actually been decoupled. I think there's a great understanding among companies here that they need each other. Medea, I don't know whether you agree. It's a little bit of a stronger statement than you made earlier, but I think directionally, right, that's what you see as well, isn't that true?
Yeah, and I agree, Ulrike, and especially because on that decision that you mentioned, it was about taking away the preferential treatment, but it was not an export ban, right? So, and then Korea also reciprocated, but then even if on the ground the market realities don't change, this then reverberates at the government-to-government level in a lack of trust and one more irritant that keeps Japan and South Korea apart. And now with the Yoon administration, their efforts to try to patch things over on many fronts, but you added now an economic irritant to already difficult, but it's more, I think, the government-to-government relationship.
Yeah, that's right. So the point here is, in response to the comment, is that is there a flip-flopping on decoupling? And I'm not sure. I think business will just go where the opportunities are, and if the opportunities are taken away, they'll go somewhere else. And so I think if this rhetoric were to stop and suddenly we say, oh, it's all good, then yeah, there would be more investment. But I'm not sure that would flip-flop would be maybe a little bit too strong, or from the business perspective.
Philip, over to you. We have 2 more questions in the queue from our live stream viewers, and I know we have 2 minutes for our scheduled time. We could probably run a few minutes over because this is such a terrific discussion. But Philip, over to you if you have any comments on this. Otherwise, I'll go to the 2 questions.
Sure. I'll just, I agree with everything Medea and Ulrike said. So just very concisely, I totally agree that I don't see sort of a Nixon visits China type of policy surprise given the current political environment in the United States. I can potentially see the other kind of surprise where US policy on China becomes even more confrontational, and that surprises Japan. Maybe that could happen depending on who becomes the next president and so forth. But the opposite seems inconceivable, at least given current conditions. There was another question in there about what happens if there's a regime change in China. Certainly that could, change things dramatically, but that would also change things quite a bit for Japan. So I think that would fall into a completely different category of question. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Let me go to the other 2 questions from live stream viewers, and I'll take them both at the same time due to time constraints. First point, considering that Japan's active role in strengthening security, including the economic fields such as data, semiconductors, etc., in the Indo-Pacific is welcomed by the US, and we spoke about that. What are some of the areas that the US and Japan can further cooperation in other parts of the world, like the global South? So really, we're already cooperating on some of this technology, data, semiconductors. What about this global South? And the second question, there may be a third here. Japan's public shows significant understanding of the need of enhancing security, national security capability. I won't try to read the Japanese, tax increase for defense is becoming a buzzword in the media, if you will. Is there any concern surrounding the public opinion towards the increase of defense budget? Is there anything that the US can do to help raise the awareness of the challenge? Ulrike, I do recognize that you have to go. You're in Japan and have engagements there, but thank you so very much. But why don't you go first if you have any immediate reaction to those 2 points before you go?
I think my 2 co-panelists are perfectly positioned to answer these very difficult questions. And so thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Abe Program for everything you've done for the field of Japan studies in the United States. And thank you, SSRC, for administering it so wonderfully over the years. And thank you, co-panelists, for a great time. So thank
you for joining us. Be well, be safe. Okay, With that, we'll turn to either Maria, Philip, who wants to kick off those two questions.
I can go.
Please,
first.
Maria.
I think that's an excellent question, and the way to answer that is, well, what are the most pressing needs? And energy security, food security, debt sustainability. Those are all COVID-19 vaccines. Those are all areas, I think. So the supply of public goods certainly is a way in which I think that both Japan and the United States could do more. There is a question on infrastructure finance. The United States is trying to pull together like G7 type of umbrella framework for infrastructure finance. I'm not yet, and I don't follow this closely, so maybe I'm wrong, but I'm hoping that this is not just a compilation of national efforts, but that there's actually real synergy, and that generates more resources in a well-coordinated manner, and not a talking point that the G7 countries contribute this much. So that, I think, is something to watch for. I think now the debt sustainability issue is very important, and a way to try to make China be more forthcoming in discussing about renegotiation of some of those debts, because there are some developing countries that are in a dire situation. And the least obvious one, but ties into a whole set of things we've been discussing today, Sato, and I wonder, technology transfer, right? I mean, we're talking about economic security and the protection of critical infrastructure, critical technology and infrastructure. So it's like raising the shield, and they're not raising the shield vis-a-vis the global south, but against China. But, I think that it's important to send the message that the United States, Japan, and other industrialized countries will have plans of technology transfer, of capacity building, precisely to help these global south partners. And that might not always be as easy as it sounds, first of all, because the commitments are expensive, but also because, Chinese firms are already very much operating in many of these countries. So I wonder how that's going to play out if you're so concerned about protecting some technologies. But it's important not to send the sense that we're just racing the moat, and not that's part of the economic integration side of the equation.
Yeah, certainly the technology transfer issue comes up a lot in the South's demands on climate change for technology transfer to help with climate change remediation and management. And it certainly came up in the recent India-hosted Global South meeting, kind of this renewed attempt and refreshed attempt to sort of plan an agenda for the South. Philip, any thoughts on that? Maria, before I let you go on that, any comment on the tax question, the tax for the defense?
Sure. I mean, that's going to be, I think it was important that the Japanese government did away with that informal ceiling of 1%. How it gets to 2% is the next question. And from what I read, core defense spending might increase indeed by 50 to 60%, which is important. And the other distance will be covered by counting things like Coast Guard, critical infrastructure as part of the defense budget, things that were not part of that. But now I think the politics kicks in when it's a question about how you pay for that. And I think that Prime Minister Kishida decided that it was not just going to be debt, but that they could not pass this on to future Japanese generations. And he made the decision that it should be through taxes, but then which taxes, in what time frame. And I think it was important that some members of his own party, not his own faction, were vocally criticizing the decision to go for a tax solution to this. So this is just unfolding. This has not yet been resolved.
Sure. We'll be watching carefully. Philip, last thoughts to you. We're about 5 minutes over, but I think we can certainly have your input before we begin to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief. And on the second topic, I do think the Boezose, kind of the tax increase for defense issue, does illustrate a broader point that the policymakers in Japan have, as Mireya and others have, pointed out, taken on sort of significant leadership in the Indo-Pacific. But the general public in Japan hasn't necessarily come along yet. And, sort of convincing the Japanese public and figuring out good messaging is an important task moving forward. And it plays right into questions like, what if there's a contingency over Taiwan? Some Japanese policymakers have made statements that suggest Japan might play some significant role in a potential military contingency, but will they have the backing of the Japanese population? It's not really clear. And it seems in some ways, policymakers are getting ahead of themselves. And so convincing the Japanese public that not only the defense spending increases, but some of these policy changes that Japan is pursuing in other areas are essential for Japan's security, and getting that buy-in is probably a very important next step. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks so much. First of all, let me just say thank you to our panelists, Maria Solis, Philip Lipsy, obviously Ulrika Sched, who's had to leave a little bit early. And I want to once again reiterate my thanks to the Abe Fellows Program, the Japan Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council. The East-West Center is very proud to be able to work with these organizations, to engage with these really terrific experts. And I'm very pleased that we were able to host this, co-host this Abe Global Forum today. So thank you for joining us. And I will now turn it over to our co-host, Nicole Levitt at SSRC, to wind us up for the evening, morning, afternoon, whatever time you're joining us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I just want to echo what Satu said. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, East-West Center and the Japan Foundation. We so appreciate our panelists today coming and joining us, especially Ulrike, who joined us very early from Japan. And thank you just for your great commentary and insight into this topic. And we hope to work with you again soon.